This story begins with a documented decision made in 1953. The United States Central Intelligence Agency and British intelligence carried out a covert operation that removed Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh from power and replaced him with a monarch aligned with Western interests. Let me be precise about this. Mohammad Mosaddegh was not an unelected figure. He was chosen through Iran's political system. His central policy decision, the one that set this entire sequence in motion, was the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. That meant removing control from British petroleum and redirecting oil revenue toward the Iranian state. Here is what the data actually shows. Oil at that time was not simply an economic resource. It was the central strategic commodity of the 20th century. Control over oil meant control over industrial growth, military capacity, and geopolitical leverage. When Mossadegh nationalized oil, he did not just change an economic arrangement. He altered a strategic structure that Britain had relied on for decades. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The response from Britain was immediate: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation. But that was not sufficient to reverse the decision. So the strategy shifted. The United States entered the picture, and together with British intelligence, they initiated what became known as Operation Ajax. This is not speculative. These are declassified documents released publicly in 2013. Operation Ajax involved paying groups inside Iran to create unrest. It involved bribing members of the Iranian military. It involved orchestrating protests designed to appear spontaneous, but were in fact organized. The objective was clear: destabilize Mossadegh's government to the point where removal became possible. And that removal happened. Mossadegh was overthrown. Power was transferred to Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who ruled as a monarch with strong alignment to the United States. Think carefully about what that means. A democratic leader removed through external intervention, a monarchy installed in his place, and a strategic resource, oil, once again aligned with Western interests. This is the first structural layer of the report. Now consider the second. The Shah ruled Iran for 26 years, from 1953 to 1979. During this period, Iran underwent visible economic and social transformation. Infrastructure expanded, universities developed, policies affecting women's rights changed. From the outside, Iran appeared to be moving toward modernization in a Western sense. But this is not what most people think it is. Underneath that modernization was a security apparatus, the Savak. This was the Shah's secret police. Their role was internal control, surveillance of political dissent, suppression of opposition. Here is what is actually happening at this level. The same external power that helped install the Shah also contributed to the training of this security apparatus. The CIA and Israel's Mossad were directly involved in shaping Savak's operational capacity, and the methods used were not abstract: torture, imprisonment, execution of political dissidents. This created a dual reality inside Iran. On one level, economic development and visible modernization. On another level, a system of coercion designed to maintain regime stability. The history here is essential, because political legitimacy is not determined only by economic growth. It is also determined by perception of sovereignty, by whether a population believes its government represents its own will or the will of an external actor. And this is the point where a critical narrative begins to form inside Iranian society. The message was simple, but structurally powerful. The Shah is not acting alone. The Shah is supported by the United States. Therefore, the consequences of his rule are not isolated to him. This perception did not remain confined to one group. Religious conservatives saw it, leftist groups saw it, nationalists saw it. These were not aligned factions ideologically, but they converged on a shared conclusion. External influence had shaped internal governance. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. Opposition inside Iran was not initially unified by ideology. It was unified by a shared interpretation of causality, the belief that domestic repression had an external origin. Let me reframe this very clearly. In 1953, an external intervention altered Iran's political trajectory. From 1953 to 1979, that trajectory was maintained through a combination of modernization and repression. Over time, the memory of how that system began did not disappear. It became more deeply embedded. This is not unusual in historical terms. We have seen this exact dynamic before. When external intervention intersects with domestic governance, the memory of that intervention often outlasts the policy outcomes it was meant to secure. And this brings us to the third layer of context. By the late 1970s, multiple pressures had converged. The Shah's governance faced increasing opposition. Economic benefits were unevenly distributed. Political repression had accumulated over decades, and the historical memory of 1953 remained active. This created conditions where opposition was no longer fragmented. Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as a central figure in this moment. His message, that the United States was the great Satan, was not delivered into a vacuum. it was received in a context where external intervention was already part of collective memory. And this is where most analysis becomes superficial. The phrase "Great Satan" is often interpreted purely as religious rhetoric. But to understand why it resonated, you have to understand the context. It connected directly to a specific historical event, the removal of Mossadegh, and the decades that followed. When the Iranian Revolution occurred in 1979, it was not a sudden rupture. It was the culmination of a long chain of decisions. The Shah was overthrown. The political system changed fundamentally, and shortly after, a group of Iranian revolutionaries stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. 52 Americans were taken hostage. They were held for 444 days. American media coverage focused on the hostage crisis itself. The event was presented as an act of aggression, without sufficient explanation of preceding context. Inside the embassy, documents were discovered. Among them were files indicating surveillance of Iranian citizens by U.S. personnel. This reinforced, rather than created, a perception that had already formed. History does not disappear. It accumulates consequences. That is the structural reality of this first report. Now consider the analytical question that follows from this. If a sequence of actions, beginning with a coup, followed by decades of aligned governance, and culminating in revolution, produces a deeply embedded perception of external interference, how does that perception shape every strategic decision that comes after? That is the question the rest of this report must answer. The next sequence of decisions begins immediately after the 1979 revolution, and it reveals something critical. The United States did not treat post-revolutionary Iran as a system to be stabilized, but as a system to be constrained. Let me be precise about this. In 1980, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. This was not a minor border conflict. It was a full-scale war that lasted 8 years, from 1980 to 1988. The scale matters here. Approximately 500,000 Iranians died during this conflict. Here's what the data actually shows. During this war, the United States provided Iraq with satellite intelligence. That intelligence included Iranian troop positions. This is not interpretive analysis. It is confirmed in declassified State Department documents. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The support did not stop at intelligence. The United States also provided Iraq with chemical weapons precursors. These were materials that enabled Saddam Hussein's regime to produce chemical weapons. Those weapons were then used against Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. Think carefully about what that means. From Tehran's perspective, this is not an abstract geopolitical alignment. It is a direct experience of a foreign power assisting an adversary in a war that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, including through the use of chemical weapons. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. Because the framing often isolates events. The hostage crisis is one event. The Iran-Iraq war is another. Nuclear development is a third. But from a structural perspective, these are not separate. They are sequential. Let me walk through the strategic logic. From Washington's standpoint, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 replaced a cooperative regime with one that was openly hostile. The immediate objective became limiting Iran's regional influence and preventing it from consolidating power after the revolution. Supporting Iraq served that objective. Iraq was positioned as a counterbalance to Iran. The logic is consistent with a broader pattern in international relations, using regional actors to constrain a perceived adversary. Now consider Beijing's style of analysis here, not in terms of alignment, but in terms of structural interpretation. When a state experiences external intervention in its internal politics, followed by external support for its opponent in a major war, the cumulative effect is not episodic, it is systemic. This is not what most people think it is. It is not simply hostility. It is a recalibration of threat perception. And this is where we introduced a critical data point that changes the structural picture. In 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, serving as a US envoy, traveled to Baghdad and met with Saddam Hussein. There is a photograph of this meeting. It exists. It is rarely shown in American public discourse. This image in isolation is symbolic, but within the sequence we are analyzing, it carries structural weight, because it represents formal engagement between the United States and a leader who, at that time, was engaged in a war with Iran, a war in which chemical weapons were being used. Perception follows pattern, not isolated events. That is the principle at work here. Now step back and examine how Tehran processes this sequence. 1953, external intervention removes a democratically elected leader. 1953 to 1979, a US-aligned regime governs with internal repression. 1979, that regime is overthrown, and the United States is identified as a central external actor in Iran's political history. 1980 to 1988, the United States supports Iraq in a war against Iran, including providing intelligence and materials linked to chemical weapons production. This is not a fragmented set of events, it is a continuous narrative. And this is where the both sides dissection becomes essential. Washington reads its actions during the Iran-Iraq War as strategic balancing, preventing a revolutionary regime from expanding influence in the region. Tehran reads the same actions as confirmation of a long-term pattern, external powers intervening in Iran's sovereignty and supporting forces that threaten its survival. Both readings follow internal logic. The problem is that both logics, running simultaneously, produce escalation. Let me be very precise about this. From Washington's perspective, Iran is a destabilizing actor in the region that must be contained. From Tehran's perspective, the United States is an external power with a documented history of intervention, regime influence, and support for adversaries. These positions are not rhetorical. They are built on specific historical experiences. And this is the point where the analysis shifts to its most critical dimension. Why does Iran pursue nuclear capability? The common explanation in public discourse often centers on ideology or religious extremism, but when you examine the decision through the lens of observed outcomes, a different logic emerges. Here is what the data actually shows. North Korea developed nuclear weapons in 2006. Since then, the United States has not carried out a military invasion of North Korea. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, did not possess nuclear weapons in 2003. The United States invaded Iraq and removed the regime. Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, agreed to dismantle its nuclear program in 2003 as part of negotiations with the United States. In 2011, Libya was subjected to military intervention and Gaddafi was killed. Think carefully about what that means. These are three separate cases, different regions, different political systems. But from the perspective of a government evaluating its own survival, they form a pattern. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining with sufficient precision. Iran's strategic calculation regarding nuclear capability is not derived from abstract ideology. It is derived from comparative analysis of state outcomes under different conditions. States that possess nuclear weapons have not been invaded by the United States. States that do not possess nuclear weapons, or that relinquish them, have been subject to intervention. This is not speculation. This is observed data. States learn from outcomes, not intentions. That is the structural principle at work. Now return to Tehran's decision-making environment. A government that has experienced external intervention in its political system, a prolonged war with external support for its adversary, and a global pattern where nuclear capability appears correlated with regime survival, is not making decisions in a vacuum. It is making decisions based on accumulated evidence. And this is where most analysis misses one critical factor. The question is not whether Iran's leadership trusts the United States. The question is whether the historical record provides any basis for that trust. From Tehran's perspective, the answer is shaped by a sequence of documented events. Now step back once more. We are no longer looking at isolated policies. We are looking at a structural relationship defined by memory, experience, and pattern recognition. And this leads directly to the structural consequence that must be addressed. If one side interprets its actions as strategic necessity, and the other interprets those same actions as existential threat, and both interpretations are grounded in real events, what mechanism exists to reconcile those perceptions? That is the question that defines the next stage of this analysis. When you place these events in sequence, 1953, 1979, the Iran-Iraq War, and the subsequent pattern of global interventions, a single structural conclusion emerges. Iran's behavior is not episodic, it is cumulative. Let me be very precise about this. States do not make strategic decisions based only on current conditions. They make them based on historical memory, institutional learning, and observed patterns of survival and collapse. In Iran's case, that memory is unusually coherent and unusually long. This is not what most people think it is. It is not a report of sudden hostility. It is the result of a system that has processed decades of interaction with a single external power and drawn conclusions from those interactions. And this is where the analysis has to shift from events to structure. The 1953 coup did not end in 1953. It established a baseline perception about external interference in Iran's sovereignty. The Shah's rule did not end in 1979. It reinforced the association between domestic governance and external backing. The Iran-Iraq War did not end in 1988. It embedded a perception of external hostility during moments of vulnerability. Each event added a layer, and this is the pattern. Not just in this case, in every case where historical memory is reinforced rather than disrupted, the structure becomes self-sustaining. Now consider how this affects present-day strategic behavior. When Iran evaluates its security environment, it is not starting from zero. It is starting from a record that includes intervention, regime alignment, war support, and global examples of regime outcomes tied to military capability. Think about the internal calculation. If a government believes that external powers have intervened in its political system, supported its adversaries in war, and acted against other states that lacked sufficient deterrence, then the pursuit of deterrence becomes not just logical, but necessary within that framework. This is where the nuclear question must be understood, not as ideology, not as defiance, but as a strategic response derived from observed evidence. And this is the part that requires careful clarity, because misunderstanding it leads directly to policy failure. Washington interprets Iran's nuclear ambitions as escalation. Tehran interprets them as deterrence. Both interpretations follow internal logic. The problem is that these logics are not compatible. Deterrence for one side appears as threat to the other. That is the structural reality. Now step back again. This is not simply a bilateral issue between two states. It is part of a broader pattern in international relations, how states respond to perceived threats based on historical experience. We have seen this exact dynamic before, in multiple regions, in multiple time periods. The structure is consistent. When trust erodes over repeated interactions, states shift from cooperation to self-protection. And once that shift occurs, reversing it becomes increasingly difficult. Let me be very precise about this. Trust is not rebuilt through statements. It is rebuilt through a sustained sequence of actions that contradict prior patterns. In this case, the existing pattern has been reinforced repeatedly over decades. So the question becomes, what would a de-escalatory path require? It would require altering the pattern. From Tehran's perspective, that would mean evidence that external powers are no longer seeking to influence internal governance or undermine regime stability. From Washington's perspective, it would mean evidence that Iran is not pursuing capabilities that could alter regional power balances in ways that threaten U.S. interests or allies. Both sides require proof, not promises. And this is where the structural constraint becomes visible, because the actions required to provide that proof are precisely the actions that each side is least willing to take. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. Each decision narrowed the available options. Each reinforcement of the pattern made alternative interpretations less credible. Now consider how this is perceived beyond the two countries directly involved. States in the global south observe this sequence. They observe the outcomes of intervention, alignment, resistance, and deterrence. And they draw their own conclusions. This is not a localized report. It is a case study. And this is where one final reframe is necessary. People often ask whether Iran is acting rationally. That is the wrong question. The correct question is whether Iran's actions are consistent with the evidence it has observed. And when you examine that evidence, from 1953 through the Iran-Iraq War and into the broader international record, the internal consistency becomes clear. This does not make the outcome stable. It does not reduce risk. It does not resolve conflict. But it does make the behavior understandable. And that distinction matters, because policy built on misunderstanding produces escalation. Policy built on accurate understanding creates at least the possibility of recalibration. Now return to the central analytical question raised at the beginning. How does historical memory shape present-day strategy? In this case, it shapes it completely. Every major decision can be traced back to a sequence of prior events. Every perception of threat is grounded in a documented experience. Every attempt at deterrence is linked to observed outcomes elsewhere. This is not randomness. It is structure. And once you see the structure, the pattern is no longer surprising. It is predictable. When history aligns with strategy, behavior becomes consistent. That is the final point. Not a justification, not a condemnation, a structural observation.